This 1886 portrait appears cheerful, until historians uncover a shocking secret about the bride. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusts her reading glasses as she carefully examines the daguerreotype that arrived at the Smithsonian's photography archive that crisp October morning. The 1886 wedding portrait shows a radiant bride in an elaborate white gown, her eyes sparkling with joy as she stands beside her dapper groom in front of a small wooden church. The image seems to capture pure happiness, a moment frozen in time from the American frontier era, when the West was still being settled and photography was considered a luxury reserved for life's most important moments. Another donation from the estate collection, her assistant remarks, placing the accompanying paperwork on her desk with a soft thud. Found in an attic in Colorado Springs. The family thought it might have historical value given its age and exceptional preservation. Sarah studies the photograph more intently, her trained eye immediately drawn to subtle details that might escape casual observation. Something about the bride's pose catches her attention, an unusual quality that seems inconsistent with typical wedding photography of the period. While her smile appears genuinely radiant, there's an unexpected rigidity to her posture that suggests she might be struggling to maintain her position. The groom's hand rests protectively on her waist, but his expression carries a subtle tension that contradicts the celebratory nature of what should be the happiest day of their lives. The quality of the photograph is exceptional for 1886, with remarkable clarity that allows Sarah to notice minute details often lost in images from that era. The bride's dress, though undeniably beautiful and expertly crafted, appears hastily altered. Visible pin marks along the seams suggest last-minute adjustments that seem unusual for what should have been a carefully planned garment. Fresh flowers in her bouquet show unmistakable signs of wilting, which strikes Sarah as odd for what should have been a meticulously orchestrated formal portrait session. There's something different about this one, Sarah murmurs to herself, reaching for her professional magnifying glass. As she leans closer, she notices the bride's hands, unnaturally pale and displaying a slight tremor that's visible even in the static medium of early photography. The trembling is subtle but distinct, captured forever in silver halide. The longer she examines the image, the more questions arise about what this seemingly joyful moment might actually be concealing beneath its surface of matrimonial bliss. Intrigued by her initial observations, and unable to shake the feeling that this photograph holds secrets beyond its apparent simplicity, Sarah decides to thoroughly research the image's origins and provenance. The estate paperwork provides frustratingly minimal information. The portrait was discovered among the belongings of recently deceased homeowner Margaret Thompson, wrapped carefully in yellowed silk and stored in a cedar box that had clearly been crafted specifically to protect this precious image from the ravages of time. No names accompany the photograph. No documentation exists to explain its significance, just this haunting image from nearly 140 years ago that seems to whisper of untold stories. The lack of identifying information only deepens Sarah's curiosity about why this particular photograph had been preserved with such obvious care and reverence across more than a century. Sarah contacts the Colorado estate executor, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, who inherited the overwhelming responsibility of cataloging and distributing Margaret Thompson's extensive possessions. The house was absolutely filled with antiques and collectibles, Helen explains over the phone, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and fascination. My aunt was quite the collector throughout her long life. But this photograph was kept completely separate from everything else, almost like it was sacred to her, more precious than any of her other treasures. The conversation reveals that Helen's great-aunt had purchased the Victorian house in 1923 from another family, suggesting the mysterious photograph predated Margaret's ownership by several decades. Sarah asks Helen to carefully search for any additional documentation that might have been overlooked during the initial estate inventory, perhaps letters, diaries, newspaper clippings, or local records that could provide crucial context about the image's significance. Meanwhile, Sarah begins examining the technical and artistic aspects of the photograph with professional scrutiny. The studio marking embossed on the back reads, Morrison & Sons Photography, Denver Territory, printed in elegant script typical of the era. A quick search through her departmental resources reveals that the Morrison studio operated from 1885 to 1889, which confirms the general time frame but raises questions about why the business had such a brief operational period. However, the business records from that tumultuous era are frustratingly incomplete, making it extremely difficult to trace specific clients or individual portrait sessions from the studio's archives. 3 days later, Helen calls with unexpected and potentially significant news that sends Sarah's pulse racing with anticipation. While methodically cleaning out a hidden compartment in her great-aunt's ornate Victorian desk, a compartment so well concealed that it had been overlooked during the initial estate inventory, she discovered a small leather journal bound with a faded ribbon and several loose papers yellowed with age. There's a letter here dated 1924, Helen says, with barely contained excitement, her voice trembling slightly. It mentions the wedding photograph specifically, and the contents are quite disturbing. I think you need to see this immediately. Sarah arranges to have the documents carefully photographed using archival techniques and sent electronically to preserve the originals while allowing immediate examination. when the high-resolution images arrive in her inbox that afternoon. She immediately focuses on the 1924 letter, written in the elegant copperplate script typical of women educated in the late Victorian era. The letter is signed by someone named Martha, whose full identity remains unknown. The letter contains a chilling passage that makes Sarah's blood run cold. The young woman in the photograph was dying even as she posed for this final image. Her family desperately wanted one last memory of her in happiness and health, knowing with terrible certainty that she would not see another sunrise. The consumption had taken hold so completely and aggressively that even standing upright for the portrait required tremendous effort and caused her considerable pain. Sarah's breath catches in her throat as the implications sink in. Consumption, tuberculosis, was indeed one of the leading causes of death in 1886 America, particularly devastating to young women in their prime years. The disease would perfectly explain the bride's pale complexion, the rigid posture she had noticed initially, and the protective way the groom held her during what she had initially interpreted as normal wedding day nervousness. Further careful examination of Martha's journal reveals her growing obsession with the photograph's tragic story and her determination to uncover the truth. She had spent years methodically trying to identify the mysterious bride, driven by what appears to be a deeply personal desire to honor her memory properly and ensure her courage was not forgotten by history. Martha's detailed notes indicate she had contacted numerous churches, cemeteries, and municipal offices throughout Colorado, systematically searching for burial records from late 1886 that might provide clues about the bride's identity. Armed with Martha's extensive research notes and driven by growing determination to solve this historical mystery, Sarah begins her own systematic investigation using modern resources and techniques unavailable to Martha decades earlier. She starts by examining Denver area tuberculosis treatment records from 1886, hoping to find patients who died near documented wedding dates. The Colorado Historical Society provides access to recently digitized death certificates, but the records from that chaotic era are frustratingly incomplete and often illegible. Sarah's significant breakthrough comes from an entirely unexpected source that demonstrates how modern technology can reveal secrets hidden for over a century. While examining the photograph under enhanced LED lighting and using digital magnification techniques, she notices extremely faint lettering embroidered on the bride's dress sleeve, delicate initials that Martha had apparently missed despite her years of careful study. Using advanced digital enhancement software unavailable in Martha's time, Sarah can clearly make out ER work delicately into the fabric with silk thread that has faded to near invisibility. This crucial discovery prompts Sarah to dramatically focus her search parameters on women with first names beginning with E, Elizabeth, Emily, Emma, Eleanor, or other variations, who died in late 1886 throughout the Colorado Territory. She expands her geographical search to include smaller communities surrounding Denver, reasoning logically that a family dealing with the stigma and tragedy of terminal tuberculosis might have sought the privacy and discretion of a rural setting for their daughter's final days. Her systematic approach yields results when the Littleton Historical Society responds to her inquiry with intriguing and potentially vital information. Their carefully maintained records mention an Elizabeth who tragically died on her wedding day in November 1886, but unfortunately, most of the detailed files were destroyed in a devastating fire that swept through their archives in the 1920s. The Society's librarian, Mr. James Patterson, a dedicated local historian, offers to search through surviving fragments and local newspaper archives that might contain obituaries, wedding announcements, or social notices from that period. Meanwhile, Sarah contacts medical historians specializing in 19th century tuberculosis treatment to better understand the disease's progression and symptoms. Dr. Robert Chen at the University of Colorado Medical School explains that advanced consumption patients sometimes experienced brief periods of apparent improvement called the rally, where they seemed remarkably healthier just before death, a phenomenon that might explain why the bride appeared well enough for a wedding ceremony despite being terminally ill. Mr. Patterson's dedicated research through the partially damaged newspaper archives yields remarkable and heartbreaking results that bring Sarah significantly closer to solving the mystery. In a charred fragment of the Littleton Weekly Chronicle from November 1886, he discovers a brief social notice that reads, "The wedding of Miss Elizabeth Rose to Mr. Thomas William was celebrated yesterday at St. Mary's Chapel outside Littleton. The bride, daughter of respected merchant William Rose, wore her grandmother's precious silk gown specially altered for the solemn occasion." The notice's unusual brevity and formal tone immediately strike Sarah as odd for a typical wedding announcement of that era, which usually included joyful details about the celebration, the couple's plans, and their family's happiness. More significantly, there's no mention of a wedding breakfast, reception, honeymoon plans, or any of the standard celebratory elements that were routinely included in such social news coverage during the 1880s. Sarah immediately searches Denver County death records under the name Elizabeth Rose, her heart racing with anticipation. The Denver County morgue records, meticulously maintained despite other widespread record losses throughout the territory, show an Elizabeth Rose William who died November 15, 1886, the exact same date as the wedding notice that Mr. Patterson discovered. The official cause of death is listed in stark clinical terms: pulmonary consumption, advanced stage. The pieces of this tragic puzzle begin forming a heartbreaking picture that explains every detail Sarah had noticed in the photograph. Elizabeth Rose had known with absolute certainty that she was dying, but had chosen to marry the man she loved during her final hours on Earth. The photograph wasn't taken before a joyous celebration as it appeared. It was captured immediately after a deathbed wedding ceremony, preserving the last precious moments of a remarkably brave young woman who refused to let tuberculosis steal her happiness completely. Sarah immediately contacts a saint, Mary's Chapel, hoping desperately that the small church might have additional records that survived the decades. The current pastor, Father Miguel Santos, explains that the original chapel unfortunately burned down in 1932, but the parish had conscientiously maintained some surviving marriage and burial records in their main church building. He agrees to search thoroughly for any documentation related to Elizabeth Rose's wedding and what must have been her funeral on the same tragic day. Father Santos discovers something absolutely extraordinary in the carefully preserved parish records: documentation that confirms Sarah's growing suspicions about the photograph's true nature. 2 separate entries exist for Elizabeth Rose on November 15, 1886, creating a historical record of unprecedented tragedy and love. The marriage register shows her wedding to Thomas William performed at 2 p.m. The burial register records her funeral service conducted at 8 p.m. the same day. Between these official entries, someone had written in faded pencil, "She lived just long enough to become his wife." This remarkable documentation definitively confirms every detail Sarah had suspected about the photograph's heartbreaking origins: the formal pose, the bride's unnatural pallor, the groom's protective stance, the wilted flowers. Everything makes perfect sense when viewed as the final act of a dying woman determined to marry her beloved before tuberculosis claimed her young life. Sarah reaches out to genealogical societies and online family history databases, hoping to trace living descendants of Thomas William or the Rose family who might possess additional information about this tragic love story. Her extensive search leads to a surprising discovery through family search records and census data. Thomas William had remarried in 1889 to a woman named Catherine, and their family had remained in the Colorado region for several generations, establishing deep roots in the community. Most remarkably, one of their great-granddaughters, Patricia William Davis, still lives in Denver and is actively involved in local historical preservation. When Sarah contacts Patricia by phone, the elderly woman is initially skeptical about the photograph's authenticity, having heard numerous stories over the years from people claiming connections to her family's past. However, when Sarah emails the enhanced digital image along with copies of the church records, Patricia becomes deeply emotional. "I've heard this story my entire life," she whispers, her voice breaking with tears. "My great-grandfather Thomas never got over losing Elizabeth. He kept her memory alive by telling us children about her incredible courage, how she insisted on wearing white and exchanging proper wedding vows, even though everyone in the family knew she was dying." Patricia reveals that Thomas had specifically commissioned the Morrison studio photographer to document the wedding because Elizabeth had personally requested it. She wanted Thomas to have a beautiful picture of their wedding day, not wanting him to remember only her illness and suffering during their brief courtship. Patricia graciously invites Sarah to her comfortable Denver home, where she shares precious family stories that have been carefully passed down through 4 generations of the William family. Thomas had been a hard-working railroad construction worker who met Elizabeth when she came to Denver seeking tuberculosis treatment in early 1886. Despite knowing her grim prognosis and the social stigma associated with the disease, he had fallen deeply and irrevocably in love with her indomitable spirit and her determination to live each day fully despite her illness. Great-grandfather used to tell us that Elizabeth was the bravest person he ever met in his entire life, Patricia explains with obvious pride, showing Sarah a small wooden box containing Thomas's most precious personal mementos. Inside, carefully preserved after more than a century, Sarah finds a faded silk ribbon, a piece of Elizabeth's wedding bouquet that Thomas had treasured until his own death in 1934. Next to it lies a letter written in Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, dated November 14, 1886, exactly 1 day before her wedding and death. The letter, addressed simply to "My dearest Thomas," reveals Elizabeth's full awareness of her approaching death and her unwavering determination to become his wife before tuberculosis ended her young life. "I know tomorrow will be my last day on this earth," she had written with remarkable composure, "but I want to spend every precious moment of it as your wife, not as your dying friend. Please don't remember me as the sick girl you tried to save. Remember me as the woman who loved you enough to marry you with her final breath." Patricia also shares that Thomas never spoke publicly about Elizabeth's death occurring on their wedding day, wanting to protect her memory from becoming a source of morbid curiosity or gossip in their small community. He told people she had died shortly after their marriage, which was technically true but preserved the dignity and privacy of their heartbreaking story. The family oral history includes intimate details, missing from any official records. Elizabeth had insisted on standing for the wedding photograph, despite barely having the strength to walk across a room. Thomas and her father had discreetly supported her weight during the brief ceremony, and the Morrison studio photographer had worked with exceptional speed to capture the image before her limited strength failed completely. The photograph meant absolutely everything to my great-grandfather, Patricia continues, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He said Elizabeth's smile in that picture showed who she really was, not a victim of a terrible disease, but a strong woman choosing love over fear, hope over despair. Through Patricia's carefully preserved family stories and the additional documentation she shares, Sarah pieces together a detailed account of Elizabeth Rose's remarkable final day. The young woman had awakened on November 15th, barely able to speak above a whisper, her breathing labored and painful. When Thomas arrived at her family's modest home that morning, she'd somehow summoned enough energy to express her desperate desire to marry him immediately, before it became impossible. Her father, William Rose, had initially protested the idea, believing Elizabeth was far too weak for any ceremony, and worried that the exertion might hasten her death. However, Elizabeth's determination proved stronger than her ravaging illness. With loving assistance from her mother and younger sister, she managed to dress in her grandmother's treasured wedding gown, which had been carefully altered to accommodate her dramatically diminished frame, explaining the hasty pinwork Sarah had noticed in the photograph. The Rose family had already quietly arranged for Father O'Brien to perform the ceremony at St. Ingbuston. Mary's Chapel, a small building chosen specifically because it was close enough that Elizabeth could make the brief journey without completely exhausting her remaining strength. The chapel's intimate size also meant fewer witnesses to what everyone understood would be both a wedding and a goodbye. Mr. Jonathan Morrison, the photographer, had agreed to bring his bulky equipment to the chapel after Thomas explained their desperate situation with heartbreaking honesty. Morrison was well known throughout Denver for his compassionate nature and had photographed several deathbed portraits for families wanting final memories of loved ones. However, this marked the first time he had been asked to document a wedding where the bride was actively dying. Patricia shares that according to detailed family legend, Elizabeth's color had improved slightly on her wedding morning. The medical phenomenon, Dr. Chen had described as the rally, a temporary improvement that gave her just enough strength to stand upright for both the ceremony and the crucial photograph that would preserve this moment forever. The actual wedding ceremony lasted only 10 precious minutes. Elizabeth spoke her vows in a whisper that barely carried through the small chapel. But witnesses later said her voice had been filled with such love and determination that every word resonated clearly in their hearts. Thomas had to support virtually all of her weight during the ring exchange, and she leaned heavily against him while Morrison positioned his camera and carefully adjusted the lighting for their portrait. The final image of Elizabeth Rose alive. Sarah's comprehensive investigation reveals that Elizabeth's extraordinary story had quietly influenced and inspired her community for many years after her tragic death. The Morrison Photography Studio never charged the William family for the wedding portrait, considering it a profound honor to document such remarkable courage in the face of death. Mr. Morrison later told colleagues that photographing Elizabeth's wedding was the most moving experience of his professional career. Father O'Brien, deeply affected by the ceremony he had performed, spoke about Elizabeth's incredible bravery in several subsequent sermons throughout that winter, though he carefully never mentioned her name to protect the family's privacy and grief. His messages about choosing love over fear resonated powerfully with his congregation, many of whom were struggling with their own hardships in the challenging frontier environment. Thomas had the original daguerreotype carefully enlarged and prominently displayed in every home he lived in throughout his life. When he remarried Catherine in 1889, a union born of companionship rather than the passionate love he had shared with Elizabeth, she insisted that Elizabeth's portrait remain in its place of honor, understanding that honoring Thomas's first wife actually strengthened rather than threatened their own marriage. Catherine reportedly told her children that Elizabeth had taught her what true, selfless love looked like, and she was grateful for that lesson. The photograph had traveled through several caring hands before eventually reaching Martha, the woman who had spent decades trying to identify the mysterious bride in her obsessive quest for answers. Patricia explains that Martha had actually been Catherine's niece, which finally explains her deep personal obsession with solving this particular mystery. Martha had grown up hearing whispered family stories about Thomas's first wife, who died on her wedding day, but had never been told Elizabeth's full name or seen the actual photograph until she inherited it from Catherine's estate. Sarah realizes with growing amazement that Martha's journal entries reflected her gradual understanding that she was actually researching her own family history. Martha's final entry, expressing regret about never identifying the brave bride, was likely a coded message intended for future family members who might discover the journal. She had probably solved the mystery years earlier, but chose to preserve Elizabeth's privacy until someone with more resources and official authority could properly honor her memory in a respectful, dignified manner. The photograph's remarkable journey from Thomas to Catherine to Martha and eventually to the estate sale represents an unbroken chain of people committed to preserving Elizabeth's story without exploiting it for sensational purposes. 6 months after beginning her investigation, Sarah organizes a special exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution titled Love Transcendent: Wedding Portraits as Historical Documents. Elizabeth's photograph serves as the emotional centerpiece, accompanied by the complete story Sarah has meticulously uncovered through her dedicated research, presenting a powerful testament to love's triumph over mortality. Patricia attends the exhibition's opening ceremony, bringing several family members who had never heard the complete story of their ancestors' brief but profound marriage. The carefully curated display includes Elizabeth's heartbreaking letter to Thomas, copies of the church records documenting both her wedding and funeral, Martha's detailed journal entries, and comprehensive historical context about tuberculosis treatment in 1886 America. Dr. Chen, the tuberculosis historian, contributes a detailed medical explanation of Elizabeth's condition and the extraordinary physical and emotional determination required for her to participate in a wedding ceremony during her final hours. His research helps visitors understand the immense suffering Elizabeth overcame to marry Thomas, making her conscious choice even more remarkable and inspiring. The exhibition attracts significant national attention, with genealogy organizations using Elizabeth's story to encourage families to preserve and research their own photographic collections more thoroughly. Sarah receives dozens of moving letters from people who discover similar hidden stories in their family histories, inspired by Elizabeth's example to dig deeper into the mysteries contained in old photographs and documents. Father Santos holds a special memorial service at the Modern Saint, Mary's Church, finally giving Elizabeth the public recognition that her family had lovingly protected her from during her lifetime and the decades following her death. Patricia reads Elizabeth's letter aloud to the assembled congregation, and everyone observes a moment of profound silence for a young woman whose love had proven stronger than death itself. The photograph now rests permanently in the Smithsonian's collection, properly identified and contextualized for future generations. A small bronze placard reads, Elizabeth Rose William, 1865-1886, married November 15th, 1886. Died November 15th, 1886. Her radiant smile in this portrait represents the eternal triumph of love over mortality. What had once appeared to be simply a cheerful wedding photograph is now recognized as one of the most powerful and moving documents of human courage and devotion in the museum's vast collection.